Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host today, joined by an irregular but full crew. We've got Cody and Tracy, which is great, and we have a special guest star. Her name is Laura Lencioni, which is totally coincidental that it's the same as mine. How you doing, Laura?
I'm great, thank you.
And Laura, exactly how are we related? And please tell the story of how people might not understand this. Something happened recently.
Yes, you are my husband. And someone recently thought that you were my father and said, "Oh, I've been following your father for years. And I really enjoy his work." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, that's my husband."
Yeah, you were doing a working genius
to his credit,
session.
Yeah. And to his credit, Pat has been gray forever and has been doing this forever. So she's been following him a long time. So that's why.
I like to say I'm blonde, by the way.
That's right. You went blonde.
And you look like you're 35, Laura.
Exactly.
So that must be what it is.
Totally.
That was hilarious, though. Yeah. I've been following your father's work. Oh, all right. Laura, thank you for joining us. Laura, you've been involved in Working Genius from the beginning. You do Working Genius sessions. You came back from a session recently and had an interesting comment, and that spurred this topic, which is what, Cody?
Genius in a box.
Yes, genius in a box. For years we've been we've used Myers-Briggs and all different kinds of assessments, and people have often said, "Oh, I don't want to be put in a box." And oftentimes that were certain types of people that just don't like to be restricted, And so that was very common. We didn't hear it that much around Working Genius. And Laura came back from doing a session where people were really concerned. In fact, tell us, Laura, how did this come up?
Well, yeah, actually one person even said they lied on their first time they did it because they didn't want to be considered something that wasn't valued by the organization. And so people were afraid that it was going to be used against them if they found out they were an ET or even a WI or whatever it was. Right. They were worried that was going to be used against them, that they wouldn't be allowed to be in certain meetings and
right.
Such
so
like
what's
that.
interesting about that is that generally speaking, people like to know what their working genius is. They're like, "Oh, please let me know so I can acknowledge to the world, I love doing these things." And even it's quite liberating to say, "And I really don't like doing these things." And so we were surprised by that. And then Laura, when you told us about these guys, mostly guys on this team, that were like actually afraid of being typed correctly because they were going to miss out on opportunities because the organization was so what was the desired type of that organization? Like the culture really valued what?
IG is huge. Yeah.
Right. So they liked when people come up with new ideas and rally everybody. And they thought, if people think I'm not an IG or that those are my frustrations. And wasn't there even some talk that people would be like, "Oh, you don't have to come to that meeting"?
Right. So these guys, they put it so that they had, WI meetings. And if you weren't a WI, then you wouldn't go, which is not the spirit of the Working Genius at all.
Exactly. And we have had people before say, like, let's say we had a CEO who is an ID and goes, "Oh, that's an ET meeting, so I can skip that one, right?" And we're always like, no. This is not about getting out of work, or as we like to say, it's not an excuse. What it means is when you go to that meeting, you should know, hey, I might be in a little bit of a deficit here, and I need to be patient, and I need to watch how this is working because I need to be involved in the process. And you can use your working genius in micro ways, not microwaves, in micro ways to help the process along, even an I can come up with an idea around implementation, as long as they're doing it within the context of the work. Maybe you can describe that better than I could, Cody.
Well, I think it is really interesting because we're pretty clear about this when we go through like certification. We talk about meetings. Identifying the elevation of the meeting is not a way of learning who to invite and who to not invite. It's a way of you showing up with the posture that lends itself to keeping it at that elevation. So if it really is a true invention meeting or invention discernment meeting, and you have tenacity, that is not a hall pass for you to avoid that meeting. It just means that you go to that meeting and say, hey, this might be a struggle for me because it's not lending itself to my genius, but it's not a hall pass to, or even for someone to disinvite someone to that meeting. Because it also is important that all of those geniuses are represented. And like you said, it's more of a relay race. It's like, hey, it's not quite my turn yet, but it will be. And it's important that I'm there in the phases, even the first and second phase of work.
And you did describe it better than I did.
Right. And I was thinking, can you imagine if you only had WIs go to the quarterly meetings or the big brainstorming offsites? Like, okay, You're here. We need you 4 times a year.
That's it.
That's exactly.
We're going to cut your pay by about 90%.
And then every quarter they'd come up with a bunch of new ideas that never get implemented because there's no one to take them from that quarterly offsite into the next phase of work. So there's all sorts of reasons to not bifurcate your meetings that way. And not the least of which, I think it's interesting too. It's not just hey, let's not invite these people. I love what you said. Like sometimes the organization unnecessary or even accidentally places too much value on one of the geniuses. Bo and I were just talking about a CEO who talked about for her whole life, she's an inventor. For her whole life, when she wasn't in leadership, the leader would not listen to her ideas. And so she said, when I become a CEO, I'm going to make sure everyone on my team, I listen to all their ideas. And then it turns out she became a CEO and she wants to give that gift to the people around her, and they don't have invention, So it's just like, it's so interesting that the way that we bring our geniuses to meetings, the way we think about what's valuable to one person and not the other. And some cultures accidentally start valuing, different geniuses, and we should be aware of that.
Yeah, and we got to remember one man's trash is another man's treasure, or woman's. And so just because, I finally get to invent, come on, we're all going to invent. There's people at the table going, I want to be here. I need to be here. But don't turn to me and ask me to come up with something out of nothing. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be there, but they shouldn't be called upon to exercise the same geniuses that you have.
I do want to explore the concept of companies overvaluing certain types of geniuses, because that can be dangerous. So can we talk a little bit about that and how that's not necessarily a good thing?
Yeah, it's important because the fact is there is going to be a preponderance of genius depending on what kind of work you do. But that means the minority ones are so important because you could have a huge blind spot. And I like to say, like, if you have a pencil factory that makes number 2 pencils, and the number 2 pencil has been the same for the last 40 years, okay, you're not going to have a ton of WIs in that factory. But even then, there's got to be some WI, like, is this the right way to do this? Are people happy? What do our customers really want? There's still wonder questions, but you're probably going to have more GEs and Ts because it's about manufacturing and just getting that done. Similarly, you have a think tank. At our company, there is a lot of discernment. We have when we look at our team map, there is a ton of people with lots of discernment. But that doesn't mean people that don't have that aren't not only welcome, but they're necessary, and they ground us and they move us forward. So yes, it might mean you'll lean more toward one way, but that might very well mean you have to more appreciate the people that don't have the typical one.
I think that's a great point, Pat, because oftentimes the people who are different than us annoy us. Like I heard that a lot in a group of these guys who are finance, right? They were the finance department, and they were very ET heavy, and the WIs and I'd heard this at another group as well, and I'm sure it was a WI who was annoying the heck out of these people because they had all these ideas. And there was an IG in the department too, who was like trying to get new ideas. And they're like, how do we get this done? And they would so I think it's about appreciating. Your point is that appreciating the other person who is different than you is so important.
And I think the appreciation part of this is huge. Like, I was just thinking, part of what happens, in fact, 20 minutes before we got on this call, I got a text from one of our employees who was like, Alan is amazing. Alan is a enablement tenacity person, and the appreciation. This is why you should all go to the same meeting. And like, Pat, we've talked about this.
Yeah.
This is the analogy to me is like, I think at every major golf tournament, there should be an average golfer that golfs last because we have no perspective for how great what we're seeing. So if you go in a room with all IDs and it's a bunch of IDs who it's easy for them to come up with new ideas and discern it, well then if you have everybody there, it's such a opportunity to appreciate the genius of other person, not be annoyed by it, but be like, man, I don't do that. I don't have that. Look at that on display. And similar is true for the people who are implementing that. Like the wonders inventors should look at that not as an annoyance that they're taking it all the way across the finish line, but in sheer appreciation and awe because they don't have that as a genius themselves.
Exactly. You know, this, and people talk about getting married. I mean, think about that. Like one of two things is going to happen. You're going to marry somebody with a similar type and go, yay, you're just like me, so that's not annoying. Or crap, we only have a few of them. Or you're going to get married to somebody who's very different than you and go, man, they're so annoying. Or yay, I'm so glad that they feel we complete things. And either one is fine. The idea is know the truth, be grateful of the diversity in your relationship, celebrate the things you have in common, but then plan for the gaps and understand one another. So it really is a choice. Am I going to appreciate the differences or am I going to be annoyed by them? Am I going to be glad we don't have any differences and get blindsided by our gaps, or are we going to fill them in? It's really about just being intentional.
Yeah. So let's go back to the whole concept of not wanting to be placed in a box. Why is it that people are so fearful of that? We kind of explored a little bit in the beginning about the weaponizing, but what else is there?
Right. Yeah, that word weaponizing is really important because sometimes we can weaponize it and go, oh gosh, you just don't have any tea. You're just such a pain. And we got to quit hiring these people without tea. And you can even joke about it. And then and it diminishes people, or you could say that about I or any of them. But I think that there's two reasons. There's two fundamental ones, Tracy. There's a healthy fear of being put in a box, and there's an unhealthy one. If you're insecure about having frustrations, weaknesses, if it just is hard for you to go, you know, I suck at some things, that's not a good thing. That's a lack of vulnerability. Everyone should gladly celebrate what they're least good at. And I think it's great when people go to a meeting and go, well, don't ask me, I don't have tea, so I'm probably going to short on this. Or don't ask me because I don't have I. That doesn't mean they're saying I'm not going to try, I'm not going to do my best. But I like it when people are self-aware and they're not afraid to say, yeah, I have things that I'm not good at. So that's an unhealthy reason to be afraid to be put in a box because you're too insecure to acknowledge what you're bad at. But the healthy reason not to want to be put in a box is because you feel like it's going to restrict your opportunity. And people are going to weaponize it and they're going to limit your participation. They're going to judge you. And that's something that a culture of a company cannot allow to happen.
You know, and it's interesting to think about, Laura, the example you brought up, which is you said that organization values invention and galvanizing. And boy, if I don't have that, then maybe I won't get the opportunities. But this is what's beautiful about Working Genius is how complementary it is that conversation should go like this. Hey, you guys have plenty of invention and galvanizing. In fact, I think you're over-indexed on invention and galvanizing, and I have discernment, which is not what you all have, but here's how I can contribute to the team. And like, there's so much complementary ways to view that versus, oh, only the inventors and galvanizers are getting the promotion. If you come to the table and you are, like you said, Pat, totally honest about, hey, you're right, I'm probably not the guy that's going to come up with new ideas, but you know what I am great at is helping you evaluate them because I have discernment, or I'm helping you implement them because I have tenacity. So I do think that there are some assessments out there that cause people to run away from each other because of differences, but Working Genius causes us to run towards each other because of those differences.
Yeah, we need each other. I was in a meeting just a few days ago, and with these two women at a university, they're wonderful. And we were talking about Working Genius, and one was an IG, and I was having so much fun with her. We were inventing, and the other was an ET, and she was so. And by the way, ETs contribute to innovation. They just do it in a different way. But what was great is when the ET said, oh my gosh, I just came up with an idea. And before she even said it, she goes, I don't know if we have enough time for it though. And we were like, that's so awesome, because she was already going, is this practical? And we loved it. But so when she came up with an idea, she was already thinking about, is this doable? Where we were like coming up with ideas, we were like, well, we don't care if it's doable. This could be just fun. And so we liked watching an ET go about coming up with an idea with a very practical mindset. And we have a guy in our office, Joe, here, and we'll just get into these liberal arts conversations about working genius or organizational health. And he comes over and he always surprises us with some insight. So we tend to, if we think they don't have anything to offer in that phase, just like if I'm in a meeting with a bunch of people implementing something, we have a big project going the next day. If I give them a new idea, an invention that's in the context of implementation, that can be really helpful. So it's really, really dangerous to think that a person without the working genius where the project is doesn't have something really good to offer. That was a long way to say, yes, I agree.
Well, too, I think it goes to the joy and energy part of working genius. It's not
Right.
that you're bad at something, it's that this does not give you joy and energy. And generally, the things that give you joy and energy are the things you're better at, but it doesn't mean you can't do something.
Yeah. In fact, Karen just wrote a great note here. She said, everybody's cups are filled at different levels. And there are people who get no joy and energy out of something, but they're actually pretty good at it. Which is kind of cool because sometimes it means they just have lots of ability to kind of force themselves to do things that they don't like, but they're still okay at it. But it's also often a function of wounds that for years they've perfected themselves in being good at something that they hated because they felt like they had to and they wouldn't be accepted if they weren't. Well, sometimes they do bring some nice tools to the table, even if they don't prefer to use them all the time.
Even in that company, that the inventor galvanizer company that you're talking about, Laura, is like, there's probably some people who have forced themselves into inventing and galvanizing, even though it's not their genius. And as a result, they're burned out by that culture. And and they might be good at it. They might have gotten proficient at coming up with new ideas or rallying people around it, but at the detriment of their own joy and fulfillment, like you said. And that's what's tragic is if people feel like, oh, I'm rewarded for that, I'm going to do that out of my competency or frustration. And then they're so good at it that they keep getting rewarded for it. And it leads to ultimately burnout and failure.
I gave a speech the other day and somebody in the audience said, should we be, I think they asked it in regard to their kids, and other people on their team, should we be working on getting good at the things that are not our geniuses, that are our frustrations? And my answer is absolutely not. Now, does that mean you shouldn't learn to tolerate them and you shouldn't learn to power through when you need to? Yeah. But when people actually try, and I've seen this happen a lot because they're kind of envy people who have skills they don't. When you try to get really good at something that you're not meant to be good at, it kind of screws you up. You're kind of messing with your natural inclinations. So there's nothing wrong with saying, yeah, I'd like to spend a little time not being terrible at that. But do not try to be something you're not meant to be. That is not how God makes us. And when we do that with our kids, like I always say, you have a child that's creative. And so you say, I need to drill them about being super disciplined. And we think like, well, I'm helping them not have a miserable life. Well, in fact, we're actually making them miserable. Or I have a child who's super disciplined. They need to go to classes to be really creative. And they're going to hate those classes. And so we think we're doing that to make them well-rounded when in fact, all we're doing is teaching them not to value their God-given geniuses. So good intentions, not good results. All right. I think we're going to wrap that up now. It's good to end these when we've made our point. We hope this is helpful for people. Go talk in your company. Sit down with your team and say, hey, do we over-index on one and people feel bad if they don't have that? Does anybody here feel guilty for not having a particular one? And do we ever weaponize it? Rarely do we do it on purpose, but ask people that very question. Or ask the question, does anybody here feel embarrassed to admit what they're not good at? And if you're the leader of the company, go ahead and celebrate what you're bad at. But don't say, I'm glad I'm bad at that because it's not important. Say, man, I wish I could do the things that you all can do that I'm bad at, and I'm glad you're good at that. Celebrate their geniuses. That's our little final piece of advice. I want to thank my wife, Laura, for being with us today. You're looking lovely. And Cody, Tracy, Karen, Matt, thank you guys for making this one work. And we'll talk to you next time on the Working Genius Podcast. God bless.